Good evening. I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, September 21st. We begin tonight in Toronto, where the funeral of a slain police constable saw the support of officers from across Canada and the U.S. Constable Andrew Hong was shot dead last week in Mississauga in what police are calling an ambush attack. Officers gave solemn salutes to Constable Hong's funeral procession this morning as it moved through the streets of Toronto. A service to celebrate his life was held at the Toronto Congress Centre. Hurricane Fiona is headed for Canada's east coast. Residents of Atlantic Canada and the eastern edge of Quebec are being warned to prepare for hurricane-force winds and intense rainfall. This comes as Hurricane Fiona remains on track to slam into the east coast by late Friday. Environment Canada is warning of possibly severe and damaging wind gusts, coastal storm surges, and pounding rain. This while Fiona merges with a low-pressure trough and then transforms into a powerful post-tropical storm on Saturday. The department points out prolonged power outages and structural damage have resulted from similar storms. A Winnipeg mother says she was scarred for life when her first child was taken away at birth by social workers. The woman, who the Canadian press has agreed not to identify, was told that she was unfit to parent her newborn daughter. Now, this was because she was just 17 at the time of the birth. New census data suggests Indigenous children continue to be overrepresented in the child welfare system. Statistics Canada released data from the 2021 census that showed Indigenous children accounting for 53.8% of all children in foster care. Now, this is a slight increase from the 2016 census. The StatsCan census report also takes a look at home ownership, which is on the decline. Young millennials in particular were less likely to own a home in 2021 than they were in 2011. According to the latest census release, 2/3 of Canadians owned a home in 2021. Now, this is down from a peak of 69% a decade earlier. The federal agency also says newly built homes are increasingly likely to be occupied by renters. This with 40.4% of new homes built between 2016 and 2021 now rented out. The report says monthly costs rose faster for renters than homeowners in the latest census period. All right, well, meanwhile, the census data shows more than 805,000 homes in the country are not suitable for the number of people living there. StatsCan says more than 630,000 homes have a one-bedroom shortfall based on the number of occupants, while just over 129,000 are short by 2 bedrooms. The data agency deems homes as not suitable when 3 or more people are occupying 1 bedroom. On the East Coast, human rights advocates hope that an announcement by Nova Scotia this week will put an end to a worrying national trend. The province says it will stop holding federal immigration detainees in provincial jails. British Columbia was the first province to take the step, terminating its contract with Canada Border Services Agency in July. The agreements require 12 months' notice for termination. This means both provinces will continue to hold federal immigration detainees into next summer. The Canadian Red Cross website says immigration detainees are people held under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act and who are not facing any criminal charges. All right, turning to Quebec now, where party leaders are preparing for the second and final debate of the election campaign. This comes as polls show the governing coalition Avenir Quebec firmly in the lead. The CAQ's 4 main opponents, the Liberals, Quebec Solidaire, the Conservatives, and the Parti Québécois, are in a virtual tie for second place. Now, that's according to the latest Ligier poll, which put the CAQ at 38%. Now, that poll also put the PQ at 13% support and the 3 other major parties at 16% as the October 3rd election draws near. An executive with Canada's largest bank says Canada won't reach its emissions goals without the oil and gas sector. RBC's Lindsay Patrick says green investments won't be enough to meet net zero emissions by 2050. RBC has been singled out by environmental groups in the past for its financing of the fossil fuel sector. The Toronto Maple Leafs will sport a milk patch on their jersey this season after reaching a partnership with dairy farmers of Ontario. The multi-year agreement comes into effect as the NHL introduces a sweater partner branding program, which allows teams to sell advertising on their jerseys beginning this upcoming season. Toronto is the third Canadian team to add an advertising patch. This was after the Montreal Canadiens reached an agreement with the Royal Bank of Canada, and the Winnipeg Jets inked a deal with Canada Life last week. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with our weekly medical segment. Dr. Abhishek Raut, the medical director of Appletree Medical Group, will join us after the break. Recent comments by the U.S. president are sparking debate around whether there is an end in sight for the pandemic. In a Sunday episode of CBS's 60 Minutes, Joe Biden acknowledged that there is a problem when it comes to COVID-19, but he believes the pandemic is over. However, the U.S. continues to see about 400 deaths per day due to the virus. Following the message, White House officials quickly clarified that the comments did not mean a change in policy. But Mr. Biden is not alone in his optimism, with the director of the WHO recently suggesting that the end of the pandemic is in sight. Well, this comes as restrictions continue to be lifted in Canada, and life seems to be returning to a pre-pandemic normal. But with flu season ahead of us, just how comfortable should we be amid the ongoing pandemic? Joining us now to talk more on this is Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's start with this, Dr. Raut. What is the current state of the pandemic in Canada?
Well, in the last 24 hours, we've had about 4,000 cases across the country. Now, keep in mind, in the beginning of August, we were seeing about 20,000 cases a day, and in April, close to 60,000 cases a day. So quite an improvement there. We continue to have COVID deaths. About 21 people died from COVID-19 in Canada in the last 24 hours. And in total, Canada has suffered around 45,000 deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic. From a prevention perspective, 31 million of us, or about 83% of Canadians, are fully vaccinated, which is much higher than the worldwide number of about 63%.
Now, if we go to Mr. Biden's interview for CBS's 60 Minutes, he was pointing to fewer people wearing masks. And right now, we can see social distancing being less of a concern in society. So is this indicative of the end of the pandemic, Dr. Raut, or are we heading toward another wave?
Well, I think both of your points of view there are actually right. The WHO also agrees that we're coming close to the end of the pandemic, and we're starting to see a lot of COVID-19 measures being gradually dropped. But I don't think that means the end of some waves. I think we're going to see a lot of them come and go, and it's quite natural to see these ebbs and flows with virus infections. I think we're definitely going to see another spike around Christmas and the holidays, but the important thing there is to make sure we're still vigilant when things worsen.
And meanwhile, we know flu season is coming up. So how will influenza impact the pandemic this fall and winter, doctor?
That's a great question. Now, remember, pre-COVID, influenza was the cause of death for about 7,000 Canadians a year. So that's still a number we'd like to decrease considerably. But here's what I've seen so far. Many people in Toronto are still wearing masks. Many are still social distancing and trying to avoid these larger crowds. So the net effect of this is we're going to see, hopefully, a lower transmission of colds and influenza during the fall and winter. So I'm cautiously optimistic that this change is going to really make a difference in terms of reducing the number of influenza cases and COVID-19.
All right, Dr. Well, a lot of experts say the COVID-19 virus will stay with us for some years to come. So what does the end of the pandemic look like?
That's an interesting question because the WHO has a very formal way of determining the end of a pandemic. It's done it about 6 times since 2007 for influenza, polio, twice for Ebola, as well as Zika and monkeypox. But really, it's an 18-member committee of experts who look at the data points like mortality rates, vaccine rates, and determine whether the pandemic has ended. So interestingly, there isn't a hard data point, but more of a scientific consensus.
All right, Dr. Raut. Now, we're also learning about the impacts of long COVID. So can you tell us a little bit more about what we know so far about it and how you see this condition being treated in the coming years? Will this be a crisis within itself?
Right. I think this is going to be a huge challenge for us to face. So what we know is with long COVID, we have fatigue, memory deficits, shortness of breath, sleep problems, and joint pains. Those are the 5 most commonly observed symptoms there. So I really hope that health ministries, both federally and provincially, will have a very targeted approach to at least these 5 issues. We're going to really need to see teams and funding for long COVID clinics where a group of healthcare workers can really effectively provide relief for patients who are suffering these symptoms.
All right, Dr. Raut, about a minute left here, but what can Canadians do to stay safe while enjoying the upcoming fall and winter seasons and the festivities that come with them?
Well, Nima, in the coming months, we're going to see a lot of diversity of reasons to gather, including Rosh Hashanah, Diwali, Halloween, Christmas, and many others. So these are really times for Canadians to deeply connect with families and friends. The pandemic is slowly coming to an end, but it's not there yet. So with that in mind, I still recommend some caution. A quick rapid test for a big event or a family gathering is still a great way to keep our loved ones safe.
Always a helpful interview. Dr. Raut, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back. And when we return, we're going to be taking a look at the rising cost of food. We'll be joined by Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University, where he's going to be unpacking the impact of inflation on household food bills. That interview and more news from around the world up next. Stay with us. Overall, inflation appears to be moderating in Canada, but the cost of food continues to rise at a breakneck pace. Statistics Canada reports that the cost of groceries was up 10.8% in August compared to the previous year. Now, that's the fastest clip the agency has recorded since 1981. Higher prices are hitting nearly every aisle of the grocery store, even items such as frozen vegetables that were once considered cheap substitutes for pricier products. Well, with us now to discuss the issue of rising food prices is Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you for inviting me back.
Now, it's clear that the cost of groceries has been rising consistently over the year, Dr. Charlebois. Is there an end in sight for our viewers?
Not right now, unfortunately. We do believe that the food inflation rate has peaked, even though it's still creeping up a little bit. We do believe that at some point, pressure points will secede. We are likely to see the rate starting to drop by the end of this year. The general inflation rate is actually dropping, so less pressure on everything else. The food inflation rate has exceeded the general inflation rate for well over a year now. And so that's quite problematic. And that's why a lot of people are noticing higher prices at the store.
And usually when we have these conversations about rising prices at the grocery store, we're talking about a specific segment of the grocery store, the dairy aisle, the bread aisle. But now we're seeing price hikes in nearly every grocery aisle, Dr. Charlebois. Why are so many products being impacted here?
Well, it's because there are three things affecting everything. Climate change. We've had a dry summer in Europe and Asia. Here in Canada, not so bad. But if climate impacts some regions of the world, we eventually get impacted eventually. So 1, 2, Ukraine, commodity prices are still higher than the 5-year average. So that's impacting the cost of processing. And finally, we also have logistics. That's due to the pandemic. Essentially, things are still not running smoothly around the world. There are still COVID protocols in different parts of the world, especially in Asia, really slowing things down, which makes things more costly, unfortunately.
Now, are there any products that maybe aren't being impacted by these price hikes, Doctor?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can look at some places where food inflation is not that much of an issue right now. Meat products, surprisingly, things appear to be more under control compared to last year. But everything else, bakery was the big surprise this month, to be honest. We weren't expecting an increase of 15 to 16% in bakery. But in dairy, as you mentioned earlier, butter is up 16% as well. So that's becoming an issue for a growing number. In a grand scheme of things, I mean, Canada has the third lowest food inflation rate in the G7. Only Japan and France have a lower food inflation rate. So in a grand scheme of things, Canada is not doing too badly, but that doesn't help Canadian families to cope with this situation of high food prices.
Some mildly comforting news there. Now, meanwhile, there's also the issue of shrinkflation, Dr. Charlebois, products shrinking in size and quantity, but staying the same price. So just how apparent is this in Canadian grocery stores?
It's becoming more apparent because of social media. People are sharing evidence in real time, and so it's making manufacturers are having a harder time just slipping through and offering us less volume for the same price, because they've been doing some good work playing around with packages, selling us the illusion that nothing has changed. But a lot of Canadians out there are smart, and they're basically taking pictures with their phone. They're comparing products, and of course, when that happens, manufacturers tend to look really bad. So I do expect more companies to be more forthcoming in the future, telling people that they've actually shrunk the package.
The power of citizen journalism. All right, Doctor, a
Yeah,
quick 30 seconds left here, but any advice for our viewers in terms of coping with these rising prices?
I think a lot of people are noticing that prices are higher, and they know we're in this for a while. So three Canadians out of four have actually changed their methods in terms of grocery shopping, which is a good sign. The problem, of course, the dark side of food inflation is that some people are skipping meals now. 8% of Canadians are skipping meals now due to higher prices. 24% of Canadians are actually buying less food compared to last year. So you can feel that a lot of people are really struggling out there, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, indeed. All right, Dr. Charlebois, we are out of time, but thank you again for joining us today. For the first time since the Second World War, Russia has announced a partial mobilization of its military reserves. President Vladimir Putin this morning announced as many as 300,000 reservists are being called up in Russia. This in what some see as an admission that its 7 months of war against Ukraine are not going as planned. He is risking a deeply unpopular step, which follows a string of battlefield losses and setbacks for his troops. Russian political analyst Dmitry Oreshkin said Mr. Putin's announcement smacked of an act of desperation. Mr. Putin also warned the West that he isn't bluffing over using all the means at his disposal to protect Russia's territory. Well, as inflation continues to dog the U.S., the Federal Reserve continues to tackle it with interest rate hikes. The bank raised its key interest rate by a substantial 3/4 of a point for the third consecutive time. When Mr. Powell spoke at an economic conference in Jackson Hole, Wyoming last month, he issued a blunt warning. He said the Fed's drive to curb inflation by aggressively raising interest rates would bring some pain for Americans. All right, well, Hurricane Fiona has strengthened into a Category 4 storm after lashing the Turks and Caicos Islands. It is forecast to edge past Bermuda later this week. The storm was blamed for causing at least 4 deaths as it tore through the Caribbean. It unleashed torrential rain in Puerto Rico, leaving a majority without power or water. Hundreds of thousands of people are scraping mud out of their homes following what authorities describe as a historic flood. Moving to Iran now, which continues to deal with backlash for the death of a 22-year-old woman under the custody of its morality police. Protests have erupted across the country and elsewhere in the world, including in Toronto this week. This comes after Mahsa Amini died while being held by the morality police for violating Iran's strictly enforced Islamic dress code. Anger has seen women remove their mandatory headscarves covering their hair. Mahsa Amini collapsed and died in custody days after she was picked up on September 13th for an allegedly loose head covering. Skyrocketing prices for electricity, natural gas, and food have led thousands to gather in Belgium to protest. Trade unions and city police say that around 10,000 people took part in Wednesday's demonstration. A Belgian media poll this week showed that 64% of people questioned are concerned that they might not be able to afford their electricity and gas bills, which have more than doubled over the last year. The German government is tackling the energy crisis by nationalizing the country's biggest gas importing company, Uniper. The decision announced on Wednesday expands state intervention in the industry to prevent an energy shortage resulting from Russia's war in Ukraine. The deal with Uniper builds on a rescue package that was agreed upon in July. As part of the agreement, the government will take a majority stake in the company. Uniper's losses have mounted as Russia has cut back natural gas supplies to European countries supporting Ukraine. Meanwhile, South Africa's president has an urgent meeting scheduled with his cabinet to discuss the country's electricity crisis. It has led to unprecedented levels of nationwide power blackouts. The state-owned power utility Eskom is implementing scheduled rolling blackouts in an attempt to save electricity. This while it is struggling to keep its aging and poorly maintained coal-fired power stations operational. Eskom produces about 95% of South Africa's electricity. Residents are going without power for up to 8 hours a day, while water supplies are also being affected. The Taliban have appointed a new education minister for Afghanistan. This is just days after the United Nations called on the country's new rulers to reopen schools for girls beyond the 6th grade. The UN estimates that more than 1 million girls have been barred from attending most of middle school as well as high school over the past year. Habibullah Aga, the current head of the Kandahar Provincial Council, will serve as the country's new education minister. NASA is fueling its moon rocket in a leak test ahead of a launch attempt as early as next week. Today's demo had barely begun when hydrogen began escaping in the same place and same time as before. The test was meant to determine whether the 98-meter rocket was ready for its first test flight. It will be a lunar orbiting mission with mannequins in place of astronauts. And once launched, the crew capsule atop the rocket will be the first to orbit the moon in 50 years. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us today on Forum Daily News, and we'll see you again next time. Take care, Canada.